welcome back, all you little chicken nuggets. Let's talk about knock today. This is going to be a two-part series. Part one, which we're dealing with today, is really going to get into the physics and the chemistry of things. If you feel like you already know everything about everything, you could probably skip this, but I still think there's some important stuff in here to be learned and discussed. Part two, though, we will be digging into HP tuners and talking about all of the various mechanisms that GM has put into the calibration file to handle knock. All right, so what is knock? Well, knock is actually the result of detonation. So detonation is basically, I don't want to say the spontaneous combustion of fuel, because it's not spontaneous. There's real causes for that. But it's really about the immediate or unexpected detonation of all of the fuel all at once. And detonation occurs on a spectrum, right? There's mild detonation and there's major detonation. And in general, most engines can tolerate a little bit of detonation. You will see a little pitting on the engine parts. That's your clue that you have some problems. And if it's catastrophic enough or a big enough detonation, it's going to blow things apart, resulting in broken metal. Pre-ignition is also used in the same breath as knock or detonation, but these are very different things. And, detonation happens after the spark plug has initiated combustion. Pre-ignition, well, pre should tell you, hey, we have the combustion of the fuel before the spark plug ever fires. Now, I don't exactly know what kind of sound is associated with pre-ignition. Um, and the fact is, pre-ignition does not exist on a spectrum. It is pretty much either you have an intact engine or you have a pile of junk on your hands. Its effect is typically very immediate. So pre-ignition is way worse than detonation. Because the pressures are so high and the temperatures are so hot, it doesn't break parts, it melts the parts. You will have a hole in your piston. Either way, we don't have a way to deal with pre-ignition, so we want to avoid that. But we do have a way of dealing with knock. So let's talk about this. Knock is typically detonation. They're used interchangeably, although detonation causes an audible knock or a ping. But knock is not pre-ignition. Also, the term pre-detonation is not a technically accurate term, and you should not use that in your vocabulary. So cause and effect, it's really about, in terms of knock, um, we the pressure inside the cylinder or combustion chamber. I'll just say cylinder, but understand I mean a combination of cylinder and combustion chamber. The pressure rises, which causes temperature to increase, and if that temperature gets high enough, it will detonate the fuel, and then you get that knock sound. So Um, pre-ignition, though, is much more simpler. It just means, hey, we have a physical hotspot. As soon as the fuel touches it, well before the spark plug pops, it's going to start burning the fuel and just a runaway um, combustion of all of the fuel. So the normal combustion process, in this very highly detailed, amazing graphic here, is slow and controlled. Spark plug sparks, and the fuel starts burning in a very orderly fashion. Just like when you set up dominoes, you hit the first one and they all lay down, they fall down. It's a chain reaction. Slow, controlled, predictable. We know what's going on. However, in the detonation cycle, which we want to avoid, it's similar at the beginning, meaning we have a slow, orderly, controlled combustion of the fuel, but that also is simultaneously increasing cylinder pressure on top of piston coming up and compressing it. And when that happens, the surrounding air or the remaining air inside the cylinder gets hot. And now you can see that we potentially have a separate source of combustion over here. This guy right here has popped, and now we can see it's starting to send out its flame front this way. And what happens when detonation, or knock, I should say, the audible knock sound is when these two flame fronts collide, just like when you're looking at a weather map and the weatherman showing you hot and cold fronts, when they touch, that's where you're going to get tornadoes or crazy weather patterns and systems. So same thing for knock. Those two flame fronts hit and they collide and they make a knock, and then yeah, big bada boom, says Lulu Multipass. All right, so pre-ignition again, the causes of that: overhanging head gasket, creating a little thin piece of sheet metal. If you have an MLS gasket in the bore, you want to avoid that. Carbon buildup, hot exhaust valve, an overheated spark plug electrode, any sharp edges. So, if you've had your heads milled or, stuff taken out of the combustion chamber, there may be a sharp edge, and that would be a good reason you probably want to soften that sharp edge, because those little thin areas are what will get hot and retain heat. So just another general graphic I found on the web after I had created my super amazing graphics, but it showed you the same thing. Good, we have spark, slow controlled. Detonation is occurring. We have the spark plug that fires, and then presumably we have a hot exhaust valve, creating a localized area of heat, and we have another flame front. And then this is pre-ignition. The spark plug has not fired, but we have a hot spot, probably carbon buildup on here that is firing off the fuel. Okay, so let's talk about some causes. So in general, temperature, fueling, mechanical design issues, or just high cylinder pressure. So anything that you can do to reduce temperatures. So high IATs, maybe you can get a better cold air intake or something, do something to reduce the IATs. High coolant, right? So maybe your radiator's plugged up with bugs and leaves or something. Obviously, boost is going to increase a lot of temperature. So you want to take care of that with a proper intercooler. And the other thing is a lean AFR. And this is, kind of two things, I think. The obvious one is liquid fuel obviously does a lot to cool. It's that latent heat of vaporization, right? When you get out of a hot shower into the air, your skin feels cold. That's water evaporating. Same thing happens with gasoline. Gasoline has a much higher latent heat of vaporization. If you took a shower in gasoline, which I would not recommend doing, you would feel even colder when you got out as compared to water. And even more so for an ethanol shower, which again, do not take an ethanol shower, but if you got out, it would feel even colder than gasoline. So when you lean out the air fuel ratio, you're losing some of your cooling capacity. Also, the other double whammy for a lean AFR is lean air fuel ratios are much harder to initiate and promote combustion. So, in other words, misfire. And when you have a misfire, you're going to have unburned fuel sitting around in that cylinder with absolutely nothing to do. Now, it is a lot harder to spontaneously combust exhaust gases than it is raw fuel. So if you cannot burn the fuel, your chances of a knock or detonation event is going to be higher. You cannot detonate already combusted exhaust gases. So obviously, we all know about octane. We'll talk a little bit more about octane. So low octane could be a problem. A bad batch of fuel, fuel's man-made, manufactured. Maybe maybe the guy driving the tanker truck accidentally put the wrong hose to the wrong tank, and the premium fuel's got the low octane stuff in it. Who knows? But also in general, understand that octane is not power. A lot of, I think, newbies think, oh, if I put premium fuel in my car, I'll make more horsepower or get better gas mileage. And that is not the case. It's just octane is a molecule and it has an anti-knock index. And we will talk about that here in a little bit. Ethanol does not have any octane molecules, but it's rated on the same octane or anti-knock index scale that gasoline is. So other issues that can cause detonation, mechanical or design issues, right? So too high of a dynamic compression ratio, a lack of squish and quench, misfire, and then oil. Oil is another thing. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but understand the refining of crude oil removes a molecule called heptane. Heptane is the exact opposite of isooctane. Isooctane as a molecule is 100 on the octane scale, so good. Heptane is 0 on the octane scale. Refining of crude oil removes heptane. Doesn't necessarily add octane, but it changes the ratio of heptane to isooctane molecules. So, where do you think engine oil fits on that spectrum of highly refined fuels from oil? It's not refined hardly at all in comparison. So, when you get oil into your cylinder, you are effectively reducing the octane rating or the anti knock index of that fuel. So, positive crankcase ventilation. Run a catch can. That's half of your battle. You also need to run a fresh air oil separator to deal with the clean side during reversion events. Those are the obvious things. Now, there's obviously engine wear in general, as far as rings, cylinder wall, and valve guides leaking oil in there. You're not going to be able to just buy a part to fix that. So, obviously, oil is bad. Don't want that inside of your combustion chamber at all. So I forgot I had this slide. I'll leave it up here for a second, but I think I covered all of that. The only thing I didn't mention is that when you burn oil, it creates a lot of carbon buildup, which is going to coat and build up on oxygen sensors and catalytic converters, reducing their effectiveness, which you don't want, and plugging things up potentially in the catalytic converter as well. So there's no good argument for burning oil, and that carbon that stays in is just going to score your rings and cylinder walls too. Oil is bad. Okay, so in general, get the best catch can you can afford and get a fresh air oil separator. There is a link here. Um, Change your life. I had no idea how rich and amazing and awesome catch cans were in the PCV system. To me, the PCV system is the unsung hero. It's the little things, right, that get me excited, I guess. But anyway, read this. It's like the CCV Bible. That's what it is. All right. So other issues is pressure. Obviously, too much boost, and then obviously, if you're running boost, that also increases IATs. So that's like a double whammy as well. Um, Most likely, though, the reason you're here is to talk about too much ignition advance. So when you advance the ignition, you start the combustion process sooner. That fuel is burning, which A generates heat, and B creates expanding gases, which generate more pressure. At the same time, the piston is traveling up, compressing everything else in the cylinder, which also creates more heat. And by the way, when you compress a gas and it gets hot, that's called adiabatic temperature rise, adiabatic. I've heard it pronounced different ways, but I think adiabatic is the proper way to say that. But that's how your air conditioner works, right? It compresses a gas, it gets hot, then you cool it while it's compressed, and then you let it expand and it gets even colder. So the same thing's going on inside your piston or your cylinder. Push up, piston goes up to compress the air, it gets hot. So we'll deal with the tuning for this ignition advance in part two. So in general, anything you can do to reduce the temps, including artificial means, water methanol injection. World War II fighter jets used this. Pretty cool. Like the P-51 Mustang was supercharged. And by doing a water injection, they later added methanol to prevent the water from freezing at cold temperatures, but it almost doubled the horsepower output. So pretty sweet. There's also fuel additives, boost juice, or just the generic octane booster as well. Aluminum cylinder heads, also a big win. I would imagine all the LS guys are probably already running aluminum heads, but you have an old school Gen 1 small block Chevy with iron heads. Just understand that aluminum is a much better conductor of heat and therefore is able to wick away high temps from the combustion chamber into the cooling system. um, Aluminum does that way better than iron. So iron is pretty bad, right? So it kind of rejects the heat. So aluminum will keep things cool and it will allow you to run more boost and more timing without detonation. Indexing spark plugs. This is kind of a controversial thing. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you do this for power or for anything else, but There's always a possibility, depending on the design of your combustion chamber. The hottest valve between the intake and exhaust is obviously the exhaust valve. The intake valve is cooled with fresh air and fuel, but the exhaust valve typically is dealing with the fuel still most likely burning as it passes by it and it gets really hot. So, where do you think a good place is that raw fuel will be sitting waiting to be detonated at a high risk zone? That's going to be right at the exhaust valve. So, if you can bias the spark plug electrode to maybe initiate combustion and start the flame front or the exhaust valve, and then you can basically eliminate any raw fuel from there, well, then perhaps maybe you can stave off detonation. I don't know that it's actually going to work, but maybe if you've exhausted all other options, that may be something. Improving squish and quench and using flat top pistons is, you basically want to get that piston as close to the quench pad on the cylinder head as possible without hitting it, right? So do that. Spark plug heat range is going to be important too. Make sure that you are using the correct heat range. And then also, if all else fails, you could retard the camshaft. And all that's going to do is move the intake valve closing angle to later in the compression stroke, therefore reducing your dynamic compression ratio. They do make adjustable timing sets, so you can basically change the relationship of the cam to the timing gear or the crankshaft, I should say. All right, so let's talk about auto ignition temperatures. And you can see we have a few various fuels here. We have diesel, gasoline, and ethanol. Now remember, we talked about oil, which is not very well refined and it has heptane in it. Well, guess what? Diesel fuel is much less refined as compared to gasoline. And what do we see? It has the lowest auto ignition temperature on this chart. Gasoline, I'm assuming this range is dependent on the octane level, but it's fairly middle of the road. And then our friend ethanol, which is used in E85, has a much higher auto ignition temperature. So when you mix ethanol with gasoline to make E85 or E50 or whatever you're dealing with, you will increase that auto ignition temperature. Now let's look at some auto ignition temperatures of some various molecules often used as additives in gasoline. First of all, there is octane, but that is not the same thing as isooctane, which is what we are interested in. And we can see heptane is very low, 223 compared to isooctane, which is 396. Now, your grandpappy probably ran fuel that had tetraethyl lead in it, and look at that, super high auto ignition temperature. So that's why they used it on those old crappy fuels before they had, ethanol based fuels or anything else. It was plentiful, it was cheap, and it did a gosh darn great job, didn't it? All right. So let's do a little science experiment here. We'll have ChatGPT do our bidding, and we'll start off with an LS3 setup. And you can see the total volume between the cylinder and combustion chamber is 847 cc's. When the piston goes to top dead center, assuming a dynamic compression ratio of 8:1, it's 105.8 cc's. We'll also say the IAT is 38 degrees centigrade or 100 on a Frankenstein scale. So if the piston goes up and just compresses that air, what temperature will the air be? This is what we're asking about the adiabatic temperature rise. And so here is the answer. Basically 441 degrees Celsius. Now, if we go back, 441 is higher than this isooctane and certainly higher than this gasoline. So this is a simplistic view of this. There's a lot more going on, including the fact that the cooling system, as the piston goes up to compress and it creates temperatures, a lot of that temperature is getting absorbed into the cooling system. And there's other things going on. But point is, you can see there is substantial temperature rise when that piston goes up to compress the fuel. All right, one other quick note. For those of you that may be viewing in Australia or the UK or somewhere, uh, A lot of times I see people posting online about how their country has much more better fuel than the United States just because our octane numbers are much lower than theirs. And that, of course, well, that's a bunch of rubbish. Bloke. Thing is, the USA uses an average of the motor octane number and the research octane number, or MON and RON, or just M and R for short. The motor octane number goes onto a very specialized machine that actually induces knock to see how much pressure that fuel can withstand. And then the research octane number is much more math and chemistry based. Well, we average the empirical, which is the motor octane number, versus the research octane number to get a more realistic viewpoint. So all of the gasoline pumps in the United States say R plus M divided by 2. Average the research plus the motor octane number, and this is what you get. When you go to Australia, you're probably going to see a 98 octane fuel, but just understand that's just the research octane number. So 98 in Australia is going to be the same as the United States 93. They're just rated differently. All right, so that concludes part one. Join me now as we begin part two.